You're coming with me." The words were not a request. They were a decree, dropped into the crisp autumn air like stones into a silent pond. Alara clutched the edge of her market stall, the coarse wood digging into her palms. Before her stood the man they called the Beast of Blackwood, the reclusive earl whose lands shadowed her village and whose reputation was as dark and tangled as the ancient woods surrounding his estate. Lord Alistair Blackwood was a figure of grim legend, a man scarred by war and soured by solitude. He rarely left his manor, and his sudden appearance here, amidst the common din of chatter and commerce, had silenced the entire market square. Alara's world was one of flour-dusted hands, the rhythmic kneading of dough, and the constant, gnawing worry of making ends meet. Her small bakery, inherited after her parents' passing, was more a testament to her stubborn will than a thriving enterprise. Each loaf she sold was a small victory against the encroaching tide of debt. Today she had sold only 3. The fourth, a rustic sourdough with a perfectly crisp crust, sat on the counter between them. It was this loaf that had brought the phantom earl down from his stone fortress. He had taken a sample from the basket she offered to passers-by, his gloved fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, shocking moment. He had eaten it slowly, his gaze impenetrable, the jagged scar that cut from his temple to his jaw tightening with each chew. And then he had delivered his verdict, his pronouncement. "My lord," Alara managed, her voice a thin thread of sound. She could feel the stares of every villager, 100 pairs of eyes burning into her back. He gestured impatiently at her stall, at the meager display of her life's work. "Your bread. It is adequate. My kitchens are a disgrace. You will be my cook." It was absurd, a madness. She was a baker, not a chef. She knew dough and yeast, not sauces and roasts fit for a nobleman's table. "I cannot, my lord. I have my own shop here." A humorless smile touched his lips, a chilling sight. "You have a failing stall that will not survive the winter. I am offering you a position, a roof, a wage that will eclipse whatever you make in a year of this." His gaze swept over her, clinical and dismissive, as if he were assessing livestock. He saw the worn fabric of her dress, the fatigue in her eyes, the desperate hope she tried so hard to conceal. He saw it all, and it seemed to fuel his certainty. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her disbelief. To be immured in that grim manor, a place children whispered was haunted by the ghosts of the earl's sorrows? To be subject to the whims of this cold, broken man? It was a gilded cage at best, a prison at worst. "Thank you for the offer, my lord, but I must decline." The air grew heavy, charged with his displeasure. He took a step closer, his height and breadth blotting out the autumn sun. His voice dropped, a low rumble meant for her alone. "That was not an offer. It was a statement of fact. My steward will settle your affairs. Gather your belongings." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers, and in their depths, she saw not cruelty, but a profound, aching emptiness that startled her more than any command. "You're coming with me." He turned then, his greatcoat swirling around him, and strode toward the waiting carriage at the edge of the square, leaving a wake of stunned silence. The decree had been issued. Her life, the small, hard-won thing she had so carefully pieced together, had just been claimed. Alara looked down at her hands, covered in a fine dusting of flour, the symbol of her modest freedom. They were trembling. She had been seen, singled out, and seized by a man who possessed everything, and now, it seemed, he possessed her as well. She had no power, no recourse. The villagers were already beginning to whisper, their pity and fear a suffocating cloak. The stones had been cast, the ripples were spreading, and Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was being dragged into the depths. Blackwood Manor was not a home. It was a mausoleum. It rose from the mists of the valley like a jagged tooth, its stone walls stained dark with age and perpetual damp. As the carriage rattled up the winding drive, Alara pressed her face to the glass, watching the forbidding facade grow. It was a place built to keep the world out and to keep its master in. Inside, a skeleton staff moved with the hushed, fearful deference of mice in a lion's den. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched with anxiety. She showed Alara to the kitchens, a vast, cavernous space of cold stone and gleaming copper that had clearly not seen a true fire in its hearth for years. "His lordship, he has simple tastes," Mrs. Gable whispered, wringing her hands in her apron. "Mostly he takes broth, sometimes toast. He dismisses every cook we hire." Alara surveyed the pristine and used space. It was the kitchen of a man who had forgotten the pleasure of food, perhaps of life itself. Her first few days were a study in silent observation. She cooked simple, nourishing meals, hearty stews, thick soups, and of course, fresh bread, the scent of which felt like a defiant act of life in the echoing stillness of the manor. She sent the food up with a young footman and never received a word of feedback. The earl remained a ghost, a heavy tread in the halls above, a fleeting shadow glimpsed through a distant window. He was a constant, oppressive presence she never saw. Her world was the kitchen, a domain of warmth and aroma she carved out of the manor's oppressive chill. She scrubbed the copper pots until they shone, stoked the fire until it roared with life, and filled the air with the comforting sense of baking bread and simmering herbs. It was her armor, her way of holding onto a piece of herself in this cold, foreign place. She refused to be cowed by the silence, by the palpable sorrow that clung to the very stones of the house. One evening, nearly a week into her forced employment, he finally appeared. The kitchen door swung open without a sound, and he was simply there, leaning against the doorframe, watching her. Alara's hands stilled in the bowl of dough she was kneading. He was dressed not in the fine clothes of an earl, but in a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows. The firelight played over the sharp planes of his face, deepening the shadows beneath his eyes and illuminating the stark, silvered line of his scar. It was a fearsome mark, a reminder of the violence that had forged his reputation. He said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her hands, buried to the wrists in the soft, pliant dough. The rhythmic, gentle motion of her work seemed to mesmerize him. "What is that?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Dough, my lord, for tomorrow's bread." He pushed off from the doorframe and walked slowly toward her workstation, his boots echoing on the stone floor. He stopped on the other side of the massive oak table, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was larger than she had realized, a mountain of a man contained by a rigid iron control. He looked from her hands to her face, his expression unreadable. "Why do you do it?" he asked. "It is my job, my lord. You hired me to be your cook." "No," he said, a flicker of something, impatience perhaps, in his eyes. "Not just that. You work as if you are building something, not merely mixing flour and water." Alara paused, surprised by the observation. She looked down at the dough, at the life she was coaxing from simple ingredients. "My father taught me," she said quietly. "He used to say that every loaf has a soul. You don't just make it. You have to listen to it, give it what it needs. Warmth, time, care." Alistair fell silent, his gaze dropping back to her hands. There was a raw, unvarnished quality to her, a straightforward dignity that he found both unnerving and compelling. All his life, he had been surrounded by artifice, by people who shaped their words and actions to get what they wanted from him. This woman, with her flour-dusted apron and her simple, profound truths, was an anomaly. He had brought her here as part of a cold, calculated plan, a desperate measure to solve a problem he refused to face head-on. He had intended to observe her from a distance, to assess her character as one might an object. But her quiet resilience, the way she had breathed life back into the dead heart of his home, was an unforeseen complication. He felt an unwelcome stirring of something he had long since buried: curiosity. "My last cook," he said, his tone flat, burned water. A small smile touched Alara's lips before she could stop it. "That is a remarkable skill, my lord." For the first time since she had met him, the hard line of his mouth softened, almost imperceptibly. The moment hung in the air, a fragile truce in the silent war between master and servant. He was still the beast, the captor, and she was still his prisoner, but in the shared warmth of the hearth, surrounded by the honest scent of baking bread, the rigid lines of their roles blurred, just for an instant. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the dough, before pulling back as if burned. He turned without another word and was gone, leaving Alara with the unsettling feeling that she had just been seen, truly seen, by the man who was determined to remain invisible. The autumn rains began in earnest, trapping the world in a perpetual gray twilight. Blackwood Manor seemed to shrink in on itself, the storms outside a mirror for the tempestuous nature of its master. Alara learned the rhythms of his melancholy. The sound of his pacing in the library overhead became a familiar torment, a restless, caged energy that frayed the nerves of the entire household. There were days he ate nothing at all, and nights when a single lamp would burn in his window until dawn. One night, the storm was particularly violent. Wind howled in the chimneys like a vengeful spirit, and rain lashed against the windows in furious sheets. Alara, unable to sleep, had come down to the kitchens for a cup of herbal tea. As she sat at the great oak table, cradling the warm mug in her hands, a sound cut through the gale, a strangled cry from the main house, sharp and full of agony. It was not a sound of physical pain, but of something far deeper, a raw tearing of the soul. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Mrs. Gable had warned her to never disturb the Earl, especially at night. He was prone to dark moods, she had said, her eyes wide with a fear that needed no explanation. But the sound came again, followed by a heavy crash, as if a piece of furniture had been thrown. Compassion, or perhaps a fool's courage, warred with her instinct for self-preservation. Before she could think better of it, she was out of the kitchen and moving through the dark, silent corridors of the manor, a single candle her only guide. She found the source of the noise in the library. The door was ajar. Inside, the room was a chaotic mess of overturned books and scattered papers. And in the center of it all stood Lord Alistair, his back to her, his shoulders heaving. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps, one hand braced against the mantelpiece as if to hold himself upright. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a landscape of deep, menacing shadows. "My lord," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He spun around, his face a mask of torment. In the flickering candlelight, his eyes were wild, unseeing. They were not the cold, controlled eyes of the Earl, but the eyes of a man reliving a nightmare. His scar stood out, a pale, stark line against his flushed skin. He didn't seem to recognize her. "Get back!" he snarled, his voice a raw rasp. "The mud! It's everywhere. Can't get a foothold." He stumbled back, his hand flying to his side as if warding off a blow. It was the war. She knew it instantly. The stories she'd heard in the village were true. He had come back from the continent a hero in name, but a broken man in spirit. Fear urged her to flee, to retreat to the safety of her kitchen and pretend she had seen nothing. But the sight of him, so powerful and yet so utterly shattered, held her fast. This was not the beast of Blackwood. This was a man drowning in his own memories. Her instincts as a nurturer, the same instincts that made her listen to the needs of her doe, took over. Slowly, deliberately, she set her candle down on a table. She did not approach him directly. Instead, she moved to the hearth, her movements calm and steady. She knelt, added a few small logs to the embers, and gently blew them back to life. A warm, golden light began to push back the shadows. She worked in silence, her focus on the simple, grounding task. He watched her, his breathing still harsh but the wildness in his eyes beginning to recede, replaced by a dawning, horrified awareness. He was seeing her now, Alara, his cook, witness to his utter undoing. Humiliation washed over him, a cold, dousing wave. "Get out," he ordered, his voice thick with shame. She rose slowly, but she did not leave. She looked at him, her expression not one of fear or pity, but of a quiet, steady understanding. "The tea is still hot in the kitchen," she said softly, "and I have some broth. It might help." Alistair stared at her, dumbfounded. He had expected shrieks, tears, or at the very least a terrified retreat. He had not expected this profound and simple calm. He had let his guard down, let the monster out of its cage, and she had not run. She had built a fire. The absurdity of it, the simple human decency of it, broke through the last vestiges of his panic. He sank into a nearby armchair, the strength draining from his limbs, burying his face in his hands. "You should not have seen that." "I saw a man in pain, my lord," she replied, her voice even. "Nothing more." She left then, and he thought that was the end of it. But 10 minutes later, she returned with a tray. On it was a steaming bowl of chicken broth, a slice of her fresh bread, and a cup of chamomile tea. She set it on the table beside him without a word and turned to leave. "Stay," he said, the word escaping him before he could stop it. It was a plea, not a command. She hesitated, then moved to the other side of the hearth, sitting not in a chair but on the floor, tucking her feet beneath her like a child. She simply sat, her presence a silent, unassuming vigil in the dim light. Alistair slowly picked up the spoon. The broth was simple, clean, and deeply comforting. It warmed him from the inside out, chasing away the bone-deep chill of his memories. He ate, and with each spoonful, he could feel the fractured pieces of himself beginning to settle. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. For the first time in years, Alistair did not feel entirely alone in his darkness. He had roared, and this quiet, unassuming woman had not fled. She had brought him soup and sat with him in the dark, an act of kindness so pure and unexpected it felt like a miracle. The night of the storm created a subtle but profound shift in the manor's atmosphere. The invisible wall between the earl and his cook had been breached, and though neither acknowledged it, a fragile trust had been forged in the firelit library. Alistair no longer remained a phantom in the upper floors. He began to find excuses, flimsy and transparent, to visit the kitchens. He would come to inspect the pantry, only to linger by the hearth watching Alara work. He would request a specific type of biscuit, then stay to discuss the merits of honey versus molasses as she mixed the ingredients. Alara found herself anticipating his visits. His presence was still intimidating, a heavy weight in her small, warm world, but it was no longer menacing. She saw glimpses of the man behind the scars and the title. He was surprisingly knowledgeable about botany, and they spent one afternoon debating the best herbs for a pot roast, his arguments as serious and well-reasoned as if they were discussing matters of state. She learned that the scowl he so often wore was less a sign of anger and more a mask for a deep, abiding sorrow. "My mother planted that rose garden," he told her one day, his gaze distant as he looked out the kitchen window toward a riot of tangled, overgrown bushes. "She loved it. After she died, my father let it go to ruin. I never learned how to bring it back. It just needs care," Alara said softly, wiping her hands on her apron. "And a firm hand. You can't be afraid to cut back the dead wood to let the new growth through." His eyes met hers, and she knew they were no longer talking about roses. The air grew thick with unspoken meaning. For Alistair, these conversations were a lifeline. Alara's straightforwardness was a balm to his cynical soul. She never flattered him or deferred to his title in their quiet moments. She spoke to him as a man, challenging his bleak pronouncements and meeting his brooding silences with a patient calm that disarmed him completely. He was beginning to feel a dangerous, unfamiliar pull toward her, a yearning for the simple peace she seemed to carry within her. This growing connection made his deception all the more agonizing. The truth of her presence here was a constant, bitter taste in his mouth. He had not brought her to Blackwood simply because he admired her bread. He had brought her here as a candidate. His late father's will was an albatross around his neck. Marry by his 30th birthday, a date now mere months away, or forfeit the Blackwood fortune to a distant, despised cousin. The stipulation was meant to force him out of his isolation, but to Alastair, it was a cruel joke. He had seen the grasping, shallow nature of the aristocratic women presented to him. They saw his title and his lands. They recoiled from his scars and his silence. So he had devised a plan born of cynicism and desperation. He would find a woman of common birth, someone with true character, unspoiled by society's greed. He would bring her into his home under a false pretense, observe her, test her. If she proved to be kind, resilient, and honest, he would offer her a marriage of convenience, a business arrangement. She would gain security and a title. He would keep his inheritance and be left to his solitude. Alara was the first and only woman he had considered. He had seen the dignity in her poverty at the market, the defiance in her eyes. He had thought it would be simple, but it was not simple. He had not accounted for the warmth of her smile, the intelligence in her conversation, the way she had faced his demons without flinching. He had not accounted for the fact that he was coming to care for her, deeply and terrifyingly. Every kind word she spoke, every shared moment of understanding, was a fresh turn of the knife of his deceit. He was testing her, yes, but he was also falling for the woman he was deceiving. One afternoon, he found her struggling to reach a heavy sack of flour on a high shelf. Without thinking, he moved behind her, his body brushing against hers as he easily lifted it down. "Thank you, my lord," she said, turning. They were standing impossibly close. He could smell the scent of yeast and cinnamon that always clung to her. Her eyes, the color of warm honey, were wide and questioning. His hand was still on the flour sack, inches from hers. He saw the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat. The urge to lean down, to close the distance between them, was a physical ache. He wanted to confess everything, to tell her the truth and beg her forgiveness for the cold calculation that had brought her here. But the words caught in his throat. He was a coward. He had built walls of stone and silence around his heart, and he did not know how to tear them down. He stepped back abruptly, the moment broken. "Be more careful," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "I cannot have my cook injuring herself." He turned and left the kitchen, leaving Alara confused and hurt by his sudden coldness. She watched him go, her heart aching with a strange new pain. She was beginning to care for this broken, difficult man, and she knew with a dreadful certainty that it could only lead to heartbreak. He was an earl and she was his cook. The chasm between them was as vast and as deep as the valley in which Blackwood Manor stood. The arrival of the Dowager Countess, Lady Beatrice Blackwood, was as welcome as a blizzard in May. She descended upon the manor in a flurry of silk, censure, and lilac water, her lorgnette a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. She was Alastair's aunt, his father's sister, and the self-appointed guardian of the family's honor. An honor she felt her nephew was single-handedly determined to destroy with his reclusive, brooding ways. "Alastair, you look dreadful," she announced, forgoing any greeting as she swept into the grand hall. "And this house, it smells of baking, like a common shop. Have you let the staff go entirely?" Alastair, who had been dreading this annual visit for weeks, merely inclined his head. "Aunt Beatrice, a pleasure as always." Lady Beatrice's sharp eyes missed nothing. She noted the clean floors, the polished silver, the faint but persistent scent of beeswax and life that had begun to permeate the manor since Alara's arrival. But she did not see improvement. She saw a deviation from the acceptable, mournful stagnation she expected. Her true purpose, as Alastair knew, was to remind him of his fast-approaching marital deadline. The situation came to a head at dinner. Alara, under strict instructions from a terrified Mrs. Gable, had prepared a multi-course meal worthy of any London townhouse. A clear consommé, roasted pheasant with a blackberry reduction, Duchess potatoes, and a delicate lemon tart for dessert. It was a masterpiece, far beyond what was expected of a simple cook. Lady Beatrice, however, was not impressed. She picked at her food, her lips pursed in a permanent state of disapproval. "The seasoning is aggressive," she commented, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. One expects a certain subtlety. Alistair ignored her, but his jaw was tight. He could see Alara through the partially open service door, her face pale with worry as she oversaw the footmen. He felt a fierce, protective anger rise in him. The Dowager Countess, sensing she was losing her audience, changed tactics. "I have been corresponding with Lady Annabel's mother," she said, her voice bright with malicious intent. "A charming girl, an impeccable bloodline. She would be a perfect match for you, Alistair. An alliance with her family would secure your position for decades." "I am not seeking a match," Alistair said, his voice dangerously low. "Nonsense. The deadline in your father's will approaches. You cannot seriously intend to let everything fall to that wastrel cousin of yours. You will marry, and you will marry well." Her eyes flickered toward the service door, a cruel, knowing glint in them. "You must maintain the standards of your station. You cannot surround yourself with commoners. It gives one ideas above their place." The insult was clear, a poison dart aimed directly at the unseen woman in the kitchen. Alara, who had just stepped forward to check on the plates, froze in the doorway, her face flushing with humiliation. She had heard every word. Something within Alistair snapped. For years, he had borne his aunt's meddling with stoic silence. But her callous cruelty toward Alara was a transgression he would not tolerate. He placed his fork and knife down with a quiet, deliberate clatter that echoed in the tense silence of the dining room. He rose to his feet, a towering, formidable figure. "That is enough." Lady Beatrice blinked, startled by his tone. "I am only thinking of your best interests." "No," Alistair said, his voice ringing with an authority she had not heard in years. He turned his head and looked directly at Alara, who stood frozen in the doorway. His eyes held hers, and in them, she saw not the cold earl or the haunted soldier, but a man making a stand. "Miss Alara is not merely my cook. She is the person who has brought more decency and warmth to this house than it has seen in a decade. Her place," he continued, his gaze shifting back to his stunned aunt, "is one of honor, and you will treat her with the respect she deserves, or you will find your visit here has come to an end." The declaration hung in the air, stunning everyone into silence. The footmen stared, wide-eyed. Mrs. Gable, hovering in the hall, gasped. Lady Beatrice's mouth opened and closed like a fish, utterly speechless. But Alistair only had eyes for Alara. He had defended her. He had publicly, unequivocally, taken her side against his own family, against his own class. He had torn down a wall that had stood between them, and in its place was a raw, terrifying vulnerability. For Alara, the humiliation of the insult was washed away by a wave of shock and a powerful, burgeoning emotion she was too afraid to name. In that moment he was not her master. He was her champion. Lady Beatrice departed the next morning in a fury of righteous indignation, her carriage wheels spitting gravel as she fled the scene of her humiliation. A profound quiet descended upon Blackwood Manor, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was not empty, but full charged with the unspoken consequences of Alistair's stand. The staff looked at Alara with a new respect, a hint of awe, and Alistair seemed to be holding his breath, waiting. That evening, Alara sought refuge in the one place that felt truly hers, the overgrown rose garden. The setting sun cast long shadows across the tangled weeds and thorny, reaching branches. She was trying to make sense of the maelstrom of her own feelings. She should have been afraid of the Earl's declaration. It had drawn a line in the sand, placing her in a precarious, impossible position. But she was not afraid. She felt a fierce, soaring hope that was just as terrifying. She heard the crunch of boots on the gravel path behind her and knew it was him. She did not turn. He came to stand beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze on the ruined garden. "I apologize for my aunt's behavior," he said, his voice low. "She has no right." "She was only saying what every one of your class thinks," Alara replied, her voice quiet but firm. "That I do not belong here. She is wrong." he said with a conviction that made her heart ache. He turned to face her, his expression serious, his eyes searching hers in the fading light. You belong here more than anyone. He took a hesitant step closer. Elara, since you arrived, this place has felt less like a tomb. You have brought light. I had forgotten what it looked like. His words were a confession, a laying down of arms. He was offering her a piece of his broken soul, and she did not know how to hold it. All the carefully constructed walls she had built around her own heart began to crumble. The master and servant, the earl and the cook, those roles melted away, leaving only a man and a woman, standing in a ruined garden, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the fragile possibility of a future. Alistair, she whispered, using his name for the first time. It felt both strange and perfectly natural on her tongue. That was all it took. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking the line of her cheek. His touch was hesitant, reverent, as if he were touching something precious he feared he might break. He leaned down, his gaze never leaving hers, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. She couldn't. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. His lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion or demand, but of a deep, desperate yearning. It was soft, tentative, full of unspoken pain and blossoming hope. It tasted of solitude and sorrow, but also of a profound, life-affirming relief. It was the kiss of a man coming home after a long and brutal war. In that moment, all the deceptions, all the social chasms, all the reasons they should not be doing this, ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of his lips on hers, the solid presence of his body shielding her from the evening chill, and the dizzying, terrifying realization that she was irrevocably in love with the beast of Blackwood. And as he deepened the kiss, a small, hopeful part of her dared to believe that he might just be in love with her, too. The dramatic irony was a razor's edge. She was falling for the man, entirely unaware of the cruel framework upon which this entire relationship had been built. The kiss in the garden was a beautiful, fragile lie. In the days that followed, a tentative joy bloomed in the manor. Alistair smiled. He actually smiled, a real, unguarded expression that transformed his harsh features and made Alara's breath catch in her throat. They spent hours together, talking in the library, walking the grounds, and working side by side in the kitchen, where he proved to be a clumsy but enthusiastic student of bread-making. He was shedding his armor piece by piece, revealing the intelligent, wounded, and deeply honorable man beneath. For Alara, it was a dream from which she never wanted to wake. For Alistair, it was a waking nightmare of his own making. His love for her was real, terrifyingly so, but it was built on a foundation of deceit, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. The end came, as it was always going to, with the return of Lady Beatrice. She did not arrive in a fury this time, but with the cold, triumphant calm of a general who has secured a winning strategy. And she was not alone. With her was a portly, grim-faced man clutching a leather portfolio, Mr. Finch, the Blackwood family solicitor. They found Alistair and Alara in the library, laughing over a passage in a book. The sight of them, so comfortable and intimate, wiped the last vestiges of warmth from the room. Alistair, Lady Beatrice said, her voice dripping with ice. We need to speak. Alone her eyes flicked to Alara, a look of pure venom in them. The cook may leave. She stays, Alistair said, his hand instinctively finding Alara's. He would not let his aunt demean her again. This was the moment of reckoning. He knew it. His aunt gave a thin, cruel smile. Very well. Perhaps it is better that she hears the full truth of her position in this house. She nodded to the solicitor. Mr. Finch, if you would be so kind as to remind my nephew of the exact terms of his late father's will. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, his eyes nervously darting between the three of them. As you know, my lord, the primary codicil states that you must be legally wed by your 30th birthday, now less than a month away, or the entirety of the Blackwood estate and title reverts to your cousin, Mr. Julian Blackwood. Alara looked at Alistair, confused. She had known nothing of this. Alistair's face was pale, his jaw set like granite. "And what?" Lady Beatrice continued, her voice rising with theatrical flair. "Was your clever, cynical solution to this predicament, nephew? Unable to stomach a marriage to a lady of your own station, you devised a plan, did you not? An experiment." She took a step toward Alara, her words sharp and deliberate, each one a poisoned dart. He decided to find a simple, pliable commoner. Someone with no connections, no family to ask awkward questions. "He brought you here, my dear, not for your baking skills, but as one might bring in a horse to see if its temperament is suitable. He was testing you." Alara's hand went slack in Alistair's. She stared at him, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy, painful rhythm. "That's not true," Alistair said, his voice strained. "It started that way, but—" "Oh, spare us the romantic revisionism," his aunt snapped. "You told me yourself years ago that if you were forced to marry, it would be a business arrangement and nothing more. You intended to observe her, and if she proved docile enough, you would offer her your name to save your fortune, and then stash her away here in the country while you resumed your life. She was a means to an end, a pawn in your game with your father's ghost." The solicitor, looking deeply uncomfortable, shuffled his papers. "There were inquiries made, my lord, before her hiring, regarding her character, her debts, her lack of local family ties." The air left Alara's lungs. It wasn't just a whim at the market. It had been calculated. He had investigated her. Her poverty, her solitude, the very things that made her vulnerable, were the qualities he had sought out. Every shared moment, every conversation, every kind look was cast in a new, hideous light. The night of the storm, was that just another test? To see if she would run. The defense against his aunt, was that to keep his prized specimen from being frightened away? And the kiss? Oh God, the kiss. Was that the final seal of approval? Proof that she was not only suitable but enamored, and would therefore be easy to control. A wave of nausea and a shame so profound it burned her from the inside out washed over her. She had been a fool, a naive, trusting fool. She had let herself believe in a fairy tale, while all along she was merely a character in a cold, aristocratic plot. She pulled her hand from his, stumbling back a step. She looked at Alistair, searching his face for any sign that this was a lie, a monstrous joke. But she saw the truth in his tormented eyes, in his stricken silence. He could not deny it. "Alara," he began, his voice cracking. "I can explain. I changed. I fell in." "Don't," she whispered, the word a shard of glass in her throat. She held up a hand to stop him, to stop the flow of more lies. "Don't say another word." She turned, her back ramrod straight, and walked out of the library. She did not run. She did not cry. A cold, dead calm had settled over her. She walked past the solicitor and the triumphant dowager countess without a glance. She walked with the dignity of a queen, even as her entire world had just been reduced to ash and rubble. The betrayal was absolute, a wound so deep she was certain it would never heal. He had not just broken her heart. He had invalidated her very self, turning her kindness, her resilience, her love, into mere qualifications for a role she never knew she was auditioning for. Alara did not pack. There was nothing in her small room that she truly considered hers. The dresses, the shoes, the warm cloak. They were all part of the costume for the role he had cast her in. She left them all behind. She put on the simple, worn dress she had arrived in, a tangible reminder of the person she had been before Lord Alistair Blackwood had decided to acquire her. She walked out of the kitchens, past a stunned Mrs. Gable, and out the massive front doors of the manor. She did not look back. The long walk back to the village was a blur of numbing pain. Each step was a measured beat away from the lie she had been living. When she finally reached her small, shuttered bakery, it felt like a haven. It was hers. It was real. She spent the next days in a fugue of grief, scrubbing floors and cleaning windows with a frantic energy, trying to scour away the feeling of his betrayal. She had been so thoroughly played. her deepest emotions manipulated for his convenience. The love she had felt, which had seemed so pure and miraculous, now felt like a sickness, a weakness he had expertly exploited. Back at the manor, a deathly silence had reclaimed its throne. Alistair was a ghost once more, but this time, his haunting was born of a fresh, self-inflicted agony. Lady Beatrice had won. She had exposed him and driven Alara away. But her victory was hollow. She had not saved him. She had merely confirmed his worst beliefs about himself, that he was a cold, calculating monster incapable of love, just like his father. He sent her away, his voice devoid of all emotion, and locked himself in the library. He picked up the book they had been reading together. A pressed wildflower she had placed between the pages fell out. It was a simple, beautiful thing, and the sight of it broke him. He finally understood the depth of his folly. His father's will had not been a trap. It had been a desperate plea from a man who had also lived a loveless life, a plea for his son to find the connection he never could, and Alistair had found it. He had found a woman of incomparable worth, of fierce intelligence and boundless compassion, and he had treated her like an object. He had approached the most important matter of his heart with the cold tactics of a general, and in doing so, he had lost the only battle that had ever truly mattered. The inheritance meant nothing. The title meant nothing. Without Alara, the manor was just a pile of stones again, and he was just a man alone with his scars. He had not just lost a potential wife. He had destroyed the one person who had seen the man behind the beast and had not been afraid. He sank into his chair, the silence of the great house his just and terrible punishment. He had earned this emptiness. He had built it with his own hands. Weeks bled into one another. Alara threw herself into her work. With a small loan from the sympathetic village vicar, she reopened her bakery. It was a struggle. Her days were long, her profits meager, but her work was honest. Every loaf she sold was a small reclamation of her own worth. She was no longer a candidate, a specimen, a cook. She was Alara, the baker. She was her own woman. The village, which had once buzzed with gossip about her summons to the manor, now treated her with a quiet respect. They saw her resilience, her refusal to be broken. But at night, in the quiet of her small room above the shop, the grief would return. She missed him. She missed the man she thought he was, the quiet conversations, the shared laughter, the hope he had kindled in her heart. It was a bitter, aching void. At Blackwood Manor, Alistair was withering. He ate nothing, spoke to no one. He paced the halls like a caged animal, the house a perfect reflection of his own desolate heart. One day, staring out at the ruined rose garden, her words came back to him. You can't be afraid to cut back the dead wood to let the new growth through. He had been living in the ruins of his past for too long, hiding behind his pain and his pride. His plan had been born of fear, fear of being hurt, fear of being seen, fear of repeating his parents' loveless marriage. That fear had made him a coward and a monster. He had to cut it out. He knew an apology would not be enough. Words were meaningless after the scale of his deception. He needed to act. He needed to prove he had changed. A grand gesture was required, not of wealth, but of heart. He had to give her back the one thing he had tried to take, her agency, her freedom. The day he rode into the village, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. He was not dressed as the Earl, but in the simple, practical clothes of a country gentleman. He did not go to her bakery. He went to the market square, the very place where he had first commanded her. He stood there, waiting, as the whispers started, as the villagers stopped to stare at the fearsome beast of Blackwood, standing alone and exposed in the center of their world. When Alara arrived to set up her small market stall, she saw him immediately. Her heart stopped. He looked thinner, haunted, but there was a new resolve in his eyes. He walked toward her, and the crowd parted before him. He stopped a few feet from her, making no move to touch her. "Alara," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent square. It was the first time she had heard it in over a month. "I have not come to ask you to return. I have come to make a public and complete apology for the inexcusable way I have treated you." He looked around, meeting the eyes of the stunned villagers, her neighbors and friends. "I am Lord Alistair Blackwood," he announced, "and I have wronged this woman. I used my power and my position to manipulate her. I brought her into my home under false pretenses, as part of a selfish and cowardly plan. I did not see her worth. I did not honor her kindness. I broke her trust, and I broke her heart. For that, I am profoundly and eternally sorry." A gasp went through the crowd. An earl did not apologize. Not to a commoner. Not in public. It was unthinkable. Alistair's gaze returned to Alara, and his eyes were full of a raw, pleading sincerity. "My deception was a monstrous thing, born of my own fear. But what I came to feel for you was not a lie. I fell in love with you, Alara. Not with a candidate, but with the strong, compassionate, brilliant woman who brought light into my darkness. The woman who faced my demons and did not run." He then held out a rolled parchment, tied with a simple ribbon. "This is not a bribe. It is restitution. It is the deed to the building your bakery is in, and the two next to it. It is yours free and clear. I want you to have the security and independence you deserve. The one I so callously threatened." He laid it gently on her stall. "I am not asking for your hand. I am not even asking for your forgiveness, for I know I have not yet earned it. I am only asking for a chance, one day, to prove that I can be a man worthy of it." He bowed his head, a gesture of complete and utter submission. He stood before her, stripped of his arrogance, his title, his pride, offering not a command, but a choice. He had given her power, security, and a public acknowledgement of her worth. He had cut away the dead wood, and now he was simply Alistair, a man hoping for new growth. The deed lay on the counter between them, a tangible symbol of his remorse. Alara stared at it, then up at Alistair's bowed head. Her heart, which she had thought shattered beyond repair, began to beat with a slow, painful, hopeful rhythm. The public square was silent, every eye on her, waiting for her verdict. She saw not the earl who had commanded her, but the man who had sat with her in the dark, who had defended her against his family, who now stood before her entire world and confessed his sins. He had not just apologized, he had transformed. He had understood that true power was not in commanding others, but in empowering them. She reached out a trembling hand and pushed the deed back toward him. "I cannot accept this," she said, her voice quiet but clear. A look of devastation crossed Alistair's face. He had failed. It was not enough. "But," she continued, a small, watery smile touching her lips for the first time in weeks, "I will accept a partner." He looked up, confused. "A partner?" "The bakery," she explained, a newfound confidence in her voice. "It is too much for one person. I need someone to help with the accounts." And to lift the heavy sacks of flour, her eyes met his, and in them, he saw not pity, but a glimmer of the same warmth he had so desperately missed. "The position comes with no wage, but it does include fresh bread. Daily." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a wave of disbelief, then a surge of radiant, unadulterated joy. It was more than he had dared to hope for. It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was a beginning, a chance to rebuild slowly, honestly, from the ground up. "I accept," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And so, the Earl of Blackwood became the most overqualified baker's apprentice in the history of the county. He worked beside her every day, learning the rhythms of her life, earning the trust of the villagers, and slowly, painstakingly, earning back her heart. There were no more secrets, no more tests. Their courtship was one of shared labor, of flour-dusted hands meeting over a kneading trough, of quiet conversations late into the night. He proved his love not with grand romantic gestures, but with the steady, daily devotion of a man who had found his purpose. Months later, they stood in the vast, sunlit kitchens of Blackwood Manor. They were married now, a quiet ceremony in the village church. Alara was not a countess stashed away in the country. She was the heart of the home, a partner in every sense of the word. The manor was no longer a tomb, but a place filled with life and laughter. The rose garden was being carefully, lovingly restored. Alistair stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, as she showed him how to properly score the top of a loaf before it went into the oven. His chin rested on her shoulder, his scar pressed gently against her cheek. It no longer seemed fearsome, but was simply a part of the man she loved. "You have flour on your nose," he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. She laughed, a sound that echoed brightly in the warm kitchen. "And you, my lord, have dough in your hair." He smiled, a genuine, easy expression that reached all the way to his eyes. He was no longer the beast of Blackwood, and she was no longer just the cook he had stolen away. They were simply Alistair and Alara, two people who had found each other through a lie, but had built a life on a foundation of unshakable truth. The sunlight streamed through the large kitchen windows, illuminating the fine dust of flour that hung in the air like golden motes, a testament to the beautiful, ordinary, and extraordinary life they were building together. Their hands, one scarred and aristocratic, the other capable and common,